Among the various modes of international terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism is most clearly an act of war. International law, however, does not recognize that form of terrorism as war, but as criminal acts subject only to criminal jurisprudence. In this case, however, it is the state itself that is the criminal. Welcome to the concluding episode of this series on terrorism and the ancient art of modern warfare. I'm Chris Mayer, Colonel, U.S. Cavalry retired, and in this series I explain the enduring philosophy of war as it was, as it is, and will continue to be regardless of advances in weaponry or politics. In the previous episodes, I proposed that international terrorism is a modern war form, one that operates in deliberate opposition to just war principles and the laws and customs of war. I also proposed that military action against terrorist organizations are not bound by the Geneva Conventions. I'm going to begin with a little bit more explanation about that. This is particularly pertinent to recent claims that military strikes on narco-traffickers are war crimes. Now, the plain text of the Geneva Convention seems to disagree with that idea. Article 2 of each of the 4 Geneva Conventions states that the conventions apply only to armed conflict between 2 or more states which have ratified the Geneva Conventions. In the event of an armed conflict between a state and a non-state armed group, Article 3 of each of the conventions only requires that in non-international armed conflicts, persons taking no part in the hostilities must be treated humanely, and that the wounded and sick must be cared for. However, even this article only applies to armed conflict occurring in the territory of a state that is a party to the conventions. This leads to several questions, which I addressed in earlier episodes of the Laws and Customs of War. First, what constitutes taking part in hostilities? Second, what is the threshold for armed conflict? Then, how does this apply to military action regarding terrorists? In 2009, the International Committee of the Red Cross published a document addressing the first question, the Interpretive Guidance on the Notion of Direct Participation in Hostilities. Now, it's not authoritative, but it does represent some general thinking. According to this guidance, persons who are members of a hostile organized armed group are legitimate targets for attack. This would include terrorists preparing or executing an attack, as well as other members of the terrorist organization who plan, organize, and supply the teams with the arms and equipment they need for that attack. The second question addresses when existing law of war conventions apply to military counterterrorist actions. The first condition where the law of war would apply is when the terrorist organization is working with state military forces in state-on-state warfare. In this case, the full spectrum of the laws and customs of war would apply to the military counterterrorist strike, to the acts of the terrorists, and to the state controlling the terrorists. The second condition is during non-international armed conflict cited in Common Article 3. According to Additional Protocol 2 of the Geneva Conventions, non-international armed conflict applies to armed conflicts between a state and organized armed groups which, operating under responsible command, exercise control over territory, enabling it to carry out sustained and concerted military operations. Protocol 2 specifies that it does not apply to isolated and sporadic acts of violence. Therefore, the law of war principle of distinction between armed forces and civilians allows for targeting members of a terrorist organization, but does not, except in rare situations, require the state attacking the terrorists to comply with the law of war in doing so. You may have noticed, however, that I generally use the broader term, the laws and customs of war. These customs are morally, if not always legally, binding. These customs can be found in the jus in bello principles of distinction, proportionality, military necessity, humanity, and to avoid using weapons and methods which are malum in se, or inherently evil. I just mentioned distinction. Military necessity and proportionality are inseparable. Regarding terrorism, a state may use whatever military force is necessary to destroy a terrorist organization, in whole or in part, while taking reasonable precautions to avoid harm to others. Humanity and no malum in se also go together. Non-combatants, wounded, and captured must be treated humanely. But how does this apply to state-sponsored terrorism? Now, there are several ways that a state could be held responsible for terrorism. The first is when a state is using a terrorist organization as part of its warfighting capability. In this case, the state can be held directly responsible for war crimes or crimes against humanity for terrorist acts this organization performs. A second way is if the state lacks the capacity to stop terrorists from using its territory to launch attacks against other states. Hezbollah, operating from Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen are examples of this. The state cannot stop the terrorist organization, but it can still be held responsible if it refuses aid and assistance from other states or the international community to stop these acts of war directed against the civilian population of other states. Now, this state is likely a failed or fragile state, and punitive measures such as sanctions may just make a bad situation worse. This is a case where military action by other states or coalitions can be justified with or without the agreement of the territorial state. A third way is when the situation progresses beyond the previous example to the state being effectively under the control of the terrorist organization, or corruption within that government makes the terrorist and government leaders almost indistinguishable. Think of the closing pages of George Orwell's Animal Farm. Some voices in the current administration suggest that this is the current situation in Venezuela. A fourth way is when a state uses a terrorist organization as a proxy force against an opponent operating from a third country or within the territory of that opponent. The intent is to destabilize, disrupt, or overthrow the opponent's government, but with practical impunity for the sponsoring state. Iran's control of terrorist organizations throughout the Middle East is an example of this. In the last two modes of state-sponsored terrorism that I just described, the state sponsor recognizes these terrorist acts as a war form, but enjoys relative impunity because international law regards international terrorism as a criminal enterprise and not as armed conflict. Now, playing whack-a-mole by attacking terrorist camps will have some value, but it will not stop the terrorist activity, as the recruitment, supply, and much of the planning and organization is done by the sponsoring state. Because international law only regards terrorism as criminal, the sponsoring state is subject to little more than economic sanctions. The burden of these sanctions is borne by the people, not the political elite, and the political elite will direct the anger of the suffering people towards the states imposing the sanctions. Even these sanctions are relatively rare. Although the United States lists 84 foreign terrorist organizations, it only declares 4 states as state sponsors of terrorism: Iran, North Korea, Syria, and Cuba. Of the 4, only Iran clearly uses terrorism as a war form, but it is not the only state that does so. It is just the only state sponsor of terrorism that is declared as such. So, what can we do about state-sponsored terrorism? In my opinion, we need to call this out as a genuine act of war waged by the sponsoring state. Military action against terrorists and their supporting facilities must be a viable response, although it will not be sufficient to end the terrorist threat. We must, within the principles of just war theory, determine and act upon the means and methods that, per Clausewitz, will create conditions so intolerable to the state sponsor that it would rather stop supporting terrorism than continue under these conditions. Within the just war construct, this response should not only look at kinetic military means and methods. Economic, diplomatic, and informational methods may be more effective when paired with necessary military actions that exercise distinction, proportionality, and humanity. But first, we must call out the state-sponsored terrorism for what it is: war.